Hello. Today we are going to work with some of the texts by Frantz Fanon based on his work Black Skin, White Masks. As you might know, because I think some of you might have read some of his work in the past, he's also the author of The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon was born in 1925 and died in 1961 as a result of sickness. He was born in Guadalupe in the Martinique Islands of the Caribbean, and his language, the language that he learned in school, was French. So a lot of what he studies is connected with being black, and how being a person of color affects the way that people see you or decode you or understand you. But he's not just looking at the phenotype, the way that we look, the skin color, the shape of the hair, the kind of hair, etc. He's also looking a lot at language. So for those of you interested in issues of language and racism or sexism even, because his theory can be applied to other axes of oppression, not just race. His thinking around language is very, very important in decolonial studies today. Decolonial studies is something that we can attribute to Fanon in a way. It's a theory that is relatively new, that tries to encompass Marxism with post-colonial studies. But Fanon is somebody much that starts writing earlier than decolonial theory. We just attribute to him the birth of this theory, in the sense that he is probably the first person of color to publish and elaborate on their own original theories on society that was not white. He's the first person of color to publish in what was until that point the white Western Academy. And we think that with Fanon, we introduce a huge change on cultural and social studies, and we call his intervention the post-colonial turn. Post-colonial turn. When the post-colonial subject, this person of color who had been first colonized by Europe, and then analyzed by European authors as the victim or the one that bear the brunt of the brutality of colonization. This is the first time that the Western Academy allows for one of these post-colonial subjects to speak up, to speak to us and tell us what he thinks his condition implies and means for him. So one of his very well-known quotes is, "It is not because the Indo-Chinese has discovered a culture of his own that he is in revolt. It is because, quite simply, it was in more than one way becoming impossible for him to breathe." If you remember, "I Can't Breathe," these were the words of Eric Gardner as he was being killed by the NYPD. So people of color have not been able to breathe for a very, very long time. It's not, we cannot isolate the condition, the situation of a person of color in the United States today from the conditions and the situation created by colonialism in the past centuries. So, as I mentioned before, he was born in Martinique, 1925, to a middle-class family, and Martinique at that time was a French colony. So he learns French mostly as his language. But he does leave Martinique in 1943 to fight in the Second World War, and he doesn't come back. He remains in Europe, studies medicine in Europe, and later on he studies psychiatry on a scholarship at the University of Lyon. And at that time, he also becomes writing political essays and plays, and he's exposed at the university in France to Marxism, and he makes connections with some of the very well-known theoreticians of the time, like Jean-Paul Sartre, for example. He married a white woman, and this is interesting because if you read his complete works, he has quite a bit to say of what it means for a black man to, I'm going to use now the vernacular that he uses, fuck a white woman. So the fact that he married this white woman is interesting to say the least, but we also have to mention that he had long-term relationships with black women as well. As an adult, he became the head of the psychiatry department in Algeria, and one of the first things that he did at that time was desegregate the wards that had been segregated by the French until then. So you could be, somebody who had huge mental health issues that might have been exactly the same as a black person sitting right next to you, but if you were a French person, you would have been taken care of in a different ward, because apparently your being crazy was different from somebody else's being crazy. So he joins the Algerian uprising against the French early on because he sees the effects of mental health on people that had been tortured by the French army. And this is something that makes him start thinking about the conditions for liberating these people. How can it happen? What does it need to happen for somebody to actually liberate themselves from that kind of oppression, beyond the fact that you could kick the French out of Algeria? You still had the French inside of you in a way, because of this torture, because of this brutality of the colonization period. So he says, if psychiatry is a medical technique that aims to enable man no longer to be a stranger to his environment, I owe it to myself to affirm that the Arab, permanently an alien in his own country, lives in a state of absolute depersonalization. The events in Algeria are the logical consequence of an abortive attempt to decerebralize a people. This comes from another text of him towards the African Revolution, but he's very clearly saying here that the French tried to annul, to obliterate the humanity of the black people, of the Arab folks that they were oppressing. So he wrote books and pamphlets in support of the Algerian Revolution. That was a very important part of his life. Eventually, he became the ambassador to Ghana for the Provisional Algerian Army. And this is something very important because it shows us that Fanon was not just an armchair revolutionary. He established a southern supply route for the Algerian army that allowed the Algerian army to receive guns that they had not been able to receive before. So this is a militant on the ground action. And unfortunately, he died quite young of leukemia. He was transferred to the United States to go to a hospital. This, another interesting thing, was somehow brokered by the CIA. But his disease was too advanced by the time he arrived to the United States. He died in this clinic in the US, and his body was returned to Algeria and buried with honors by the Algerian National Army of Liberation that was in control of Algeria after the revolution against the French. Here's a picture of Algeria. As you can see, it's very close to Libya and Morocco. So the French took over Algiers in 1834, and after they were expelled, the country went through a number of changes. The revolution that Fanon saw launch pretty much was obliterated by a number of issues, and today 90% of the population is Muslim. In the 50s is when they started this guerrilla war that was led by the National Liberation Front, the FLN. And in 62, the FLN won independence after overcoming immense amounts of brutality by the French. There was torture, there were massacres, and all kinds of atrocities. I hope that we'll have a little bit of time next class to watch a few clips of the movie The Battle of Algiers that was filmed on site shortly after the revolution, with people from the community being part of the film. It's one of the most celebrated films on revolutions in the world, pretty much. So the timeline: 62, they gain independence, and until the Berlin Wall falls, they pretty much conduct what was called the non-aligned movements of the Cold War. These were movements of countries that were trying to be independent both from the Soviet Union and the United States. So it was called the Third World, or the third way of accessing social change. Non-aligned was another way of referring to these groups. So Algiers was obviously a big part of this group. Argentina at that time also joins that group of the non-aligned. Several countries around the world, and eventually Cuba also becomes a non-aligned, although they are very much aligned with the Soviet Union at the time. Cuba tries to also have like a third world position regarding capitalism versus communism. So in 88, the Spring of Algiers ends, and there's a single rule party taking over at that point, and the government has to, in order to stay in power, they conduct a massacre, and they kill 300 people that were insurrecting against them. So this is also a very common thing that we see in these groups of the non-aligned, that they initiate their governments with huge hopes and enormous mobilization of the people, and then eventually, as the economy doesn't pan out, they start leaning towards the right, and eventually it becomes some kind of a dictatorship. So in 1989, they adopt a new constitution, and they allow now for political parties and freedom of the press. But in 1999, the Islamic Salvation Front wins the elections. Those elections are canceled by the army. So at that point, they go into a civil war with armed religious conservative groups. And in 2007, religious conservative groups take power, and they are still active today in government. So there are many studies about why Algiers, that was such a beam of hope for people oppressed by Western powers, becomes an oppressive regime itself. We could look not only at the situation within Algiers, but also see how these countries were isolated by both the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, and how that isolation created huge economic problems that, instead of being resolved through the left by, for example, allowing for real democracy in the workplace and democracy in the neighborhoods, instead of that, there's like a move to control things from the top. And this inevitably, as it's led by the state, becomes extremely violent and repressive. So going to the book that we are reading, the conclusion that you're reading for today is called Black Skin, White Masks. And Fanon, following his psychoanalysis background, developed this psychoanalytic paradigm to explain the consequences of colonialism and racial subjectivity, excuse me, and racial subjectivity in folks that had been racialized and colonized. His paradigm is not just psychiatric. He also uses tropes of Marxism and existentialism, and also phenomenology. His work is extremely influential on contemporary post-colonial, decolonial studies, as I said initially. And the main thesis here is that white cultural values get under the skin of the black man. He's always talking about black man. He doesn't talk about humanity. He's very centered on the word man, unfortunately. And the black man is alienated, trying to incorporate this white cultural values that are not his own. So feminists, as I somehow advanced a little bit in my previous sentence, have accused him of simplifying and being unsympathetic towards the black woman. He considers that what black women were complicit in colonization because they offered comfort to the white man. So many feminists have accused him of being of not taking into account women's agency. So again, I hope that we will watch a little bit of the Battle of Algiers, but there's another documentary by Fanon that's called Black Skins, White Masks that I think would be excellent for you to watch if you're interested in this subject. So the main concepts, he's trying to develop a new humanism. We are kind of over that paradigm now. Nobody's trying nowadays to work on a paradigm that would decolor human beings, which is a little bit what Fanon tried to do here. That's not the part of Fanon's work that we are most interested in nowadays. But in any case, he has a critique of humanism, which would be the philosophical equivalent of the concept of liberalism in political science. Is the idea that we are all one people, that none of us is different from each other. You know how for liberalism that was very progressive because it meant that we could choose, we could elect our own government instead of having to wait for God to tell us who the king was or the queen, if we were lucky, but rather thinking that all human beings are equal. So this paradigm was used to colonize people of color because they were deemed like, humans that were not quite able to achieve all the wonderful achievements that humanity had, because they were kind of, sort of like weighted down upon by these backward cultures and backward religions, and not having, the idea of colonizing the earth like the white man had. So they needed to be helped. So basically, humanism ended up in colonialism for the white person. So Fanon is trying to say, well, we are all humans, beyond whether we are white or black. Nowadays, we have trouble with this because we want people to realize that we are of a different color. If we are of a different color, that it's not white, because that means something. It means that I went through certain moments, certain situations of oppression that white people didn't go through, for example. So if you tell me I don't see color, you are telling me I don't see your past, I don't see your condition, I don't see your situation. You're ignoring the fact that as a white person, you have the upper hand in our relationship. But Fanon is not trying to go there. Fanon is just trying to show this extremely good, well-intentioned white leftist that he dealt with in France when he was training as a psychiatrist, to realize that we are all humans. But as I said, he goes around it in a way that we don't do any longer. So Gayatri Spivak, who's one of the queens of post-colonial theory, says that there's an affinity between the imperialist subject and the subject of humanism, meaning that the imperialist subject, who would be this person of color that the white people are trying to present as needy of their help, which means in need of their colonizing them, and the subject of humanism are the same, and both of them are somewhat lacking, if they are black, in humanity. So Fanon calls for a new humanism predicated upon a formal repudiation of the degraded European form, as European humanists never stop talking of man, yet massacres him at any and every one of its street corners at every corner of the world. So we keep talking about people of color and how important man is, but then we go and in order to help this man, we have to massacre this man. So the author points out to this concept in both texts, while it is more clearly developed in The Wretched of the Earth, this idea that humanism is the death of humanity when it's not white. He says, I am a man. In this sense, the Peloponnesian War is as much mine as the invention of the compass. Face to face with the white man, the Negro has a past to legitimate, a vengeance to exact. Face to face with the Negro, the contemporary white man feels the need to recall the times of cannibalism. So he's starting to say that when the black man looks at the white man, he needs to take revenge over the fact that he's being envisioned by this white man as a cannibal, still today. He also says, I find myself suddenly in the world and I recognize that I have one right alone, that of demanding human behavior from the other. I am not the slave of the slavery that dehumanized my ancestors. He's claiming humanity. The Negro is not any more than the white man. So again, this is a call to humanize humanism. One of his main concepts, obviously, is that of racism. And Grossfogel, who's a Latin American decolonial thinker, tries to explain how Fanon sees racism with this phrase. Racism is a global hierarchy of superiority and inferiority over the line of what is human, that has been politically produced and reproduced as a structure of domination over centuries by the imperialist, Eurocentric, Christian-centric, capitalist, patriarchal, modern colonial system. So racism for him is a way to establish who's a human, who's not human, and from there on reproduce and produce structures of domination that are useful for imperialist practices. If we bomb, for example, Iran, and we tell people that in the United States that we are bombing them because they are such brutal criminals, that their only interest is to hurt and produce as much pain on white American people because they hate white Americans because they are free. Well, that's one way of talking about racism. We are showing that Iran is less human than white people in the United States, so we need to bomb them to ensure that those who are really humans, the white people in the United States, will be safe. It's Eurocentric because we are using our ideas of what civilization, what is the proper way for a people to develop. We are using our own experiences and we are saying these people are not as good as we are. Look at how they are still ruled by these old-fashioned religions, how they are normed by a religion that doesn't take into account others, that doesn't take into account women, etc., etc., etc. So you can decode every one of these phrases, Christian-centric, capitalist, patriarchal, and the modern colonial system in the same way. And what Grossfogel is saying is that for Fanon, racism is the way that all of this is achieved, including capitalism. And many people will say, yes, Fanon is right, because capitalism is only able to develop in Europe because of all the resources that were stolen through wars, famines, massacres, and brutality from us, people living in the Americas. We funded the Industrial Revolution, and you can read more about that if you read the text on Eurocentrism by Quijano, and if you read Caliban and the Witch, where Federici talks about the accumulation of capital. So Fanon's take on racism is open and allows for different expressions of racism. So you can talk about racism using his analysis based on color, on skin color, on ethnicity, whether you're Arab or you are not, language, do you have an accent like I do, culture, do you commune with the cultures of white people, or do you have a different culture and you need to hide that culture, or religion? So another super important concept of Fanon is the zones of being and no being. So for him, there's a zone of non-being, an extraordinary, sterile and arid region, an utterly naked declivity where authentic upheaval can be born. This zone of no being, of non-being, is what people of color experience when they live in a situation of colonization. Subjects located above the human line in what he calls a being zone are the white people, while the subjects that live below this line live in the non-being zone, and these are the people of color. And again, we can think of those, this idea of being and non-being zones applied not only to countries that were colonized, but also to populations that were colonized, like the black population, for example, in the United States, that many consider a colonized population because they were brought to the United States under slavery, not on their own free will, and they were marginalized and enslaved and continue to be marginalized even after slavery was over. From this division of being and non-being, the zones of being and non-being, one can understand that, for example, gender or sexual oppression are lived differently in two zones. So we can talk about how we are white people, but we are also white women. So we could think, well, how does these areas of being and non-being affect each other if we put different kinds of oppressors on top? Male versus female, hetero, or better yet, cis versus non-cis. Both zones are non-homogeneous and stratified, which means that if I'm a person who's a person of color but has white skin, and maybe I have money, and maybe my religion is Christianity and not Islam, well, that shows you a little bit of how non-homogeneous and stratified these areas, both the being and non-being areas, are. So this is a very useful concept for anybody who's trying to write about any kind of situation of oppression. Then he talks also about the master's language, language as a tool of colonization. Right now, I'm making a brutal effort to try and pronounce my T's as we pronounce them in English and not as we pronounce them in Spanish, which are quite different. And I'm making a number of efforts in order to prove to you that I'm a person, that I am smart, that I can teach this class, although my language skills are not as good as the language skills of a native English speaker. So he says the black person talks an inferior French, Creole, we call it. There's a hierarchy of languages, right? A dialect is less than a language. White French people talk French. People in the colonies, people of color in the colonies, they don't talk French. They talk some kind of Creole. So white people address black people in simplified, creolized French many times to make sure that they can be understood by these people that they assume are simple-minded because they don't have the language skills. A man who has a language consequently possesses the world expressed and implied by that language. Beautiful phrase, no? One of his favorite quotes. And talking about the Antilles, the language spoken officially is French. Teachers keep a close watch over the children to make sure they do not use Creole. Think about Native American people being forced to speak English only in the boarding schools where they were sent to de-Indianize them. Alienation, a concept that Marx started working on, but he changes. Marx talks about alienation in the sense that workers go to work for a corporation, they put their souls in the piece that they are making, and then they lose this because most of what we produce for a corporation doesn't come home with us. It belongs to the corporation that buys our capacity to work, our capacity to labor. But Fanon talks about alienation in the sense of racism. He says, I do not carry innocence to the point of believing that appeals to reason or to respect for human dignity can alter reality. For the Negro who works on a sugar plantation in Le Robert, there is only one solution: to fight. He will embark on this struggle and he will pursue it, not as a result of a Marxist or idealistic analysis, that quite simply because he cannot conceive of life otherwise than in the form of a battle against exploitation, misery, and hunger. I'll read that again. He will embark on this struggle and he will pursue it, not as a result of a Marxist or idealistic analysis, but quite simply because he cannot conceive of life otherwise than in the form of a battle against exploitation, misery, and hunger. So critical race theorists contemporarily have picked up on this to talk about how, for people who are brutally oppressed, sometimes the struggle against the oppressor itself is life. It doesn't matter for them if you are going to win or lose. What matters is that you can reaffirm your life by fighting against his oppressor. The black man wants to be like the white man. For the black man, there's only one destiny. It is white. And long ago, the black man admitted the unarguable superiority of the white man, and all his efforts are aimed at achieving a white existence. So this, for Fanon, can only be eliminated by destroying the white man. So he was extremely influential over some of his contemporaries, like Jean-Paul Sartre, over Marxism in general. Lacan, who was Freud's, he married Freud's daughter, whatever that relationship is, and to Aimé Césaire, who was also a huge, important leader of the non-aligned movement. His political legacy over Stephen Biko in South Africa, the Che Guevara, the Black Panthers, and Paulo Freire. So some ideas to think about: what links can be established between the black skin, white mass, colonization, and violent revolt. Another thing to think about: does colonial exploitation, torture, massacres, and other repressive methods justify violent uprising? If so, why? If not, explain why not. Can we build a new home with the master's tools? Stuff to think about. Ciao.